Hi, welcome everybody. Really pleased to introduce you to today's ISE webinar, which we're doing in conjunction with Prospects GISC. I'm going to hand over very shortly to the team. We're going to be talking all things graduate labour market, student labour market, regional talent pools, and actually is there any mismatch between actually the needs and expectations of employers and actually what is available out there on the supply side in the market. My name is Steve Isherwood, Chief Executive of the ISE, and I'll be acting as a little bit of a host to today. If you've not joined an ISE webinar before, we try to make these as interactive as possible. We're on the Zoom platform. If you've got any questions for Chris, Paul or Charlie as we go through the session, drop them into the Q&A box. We'll keep an eye on them as we go along, but also we should have some time at the end if we need to mop any others. So please pop those questions in and we'll be keeping an eye on them. I think that's enough from me. I think we should get straight into the content. So Paul, over to you. Do you want to take it from here?
Perfect. Thank you, Stephen. On behalf of GISC and Prospects, good afternoon and welcome. We're going to be looking at the student graduate talent pool in the context of an impending recession. I'm joined by Dr. Charlie Ball, Head of Labour Market Intelligence. Charlie works in our data analytics team. I'm also joined by Chris Ree, Head of Commercial Service at Prospects. We're going to be looking at the current economic situation and analysing the characteristics of the early talent pool. We're going to try and make this more conversational rather than presentation. We're going to be keeping an eye on the chat, so please pop any questions or talking points in there, and we'll try and deal with them as the presentation goes on. But don't worry, we've devoted some time at the end to cover any questions that you may have. So without further ado, Charlie, what's happening in the economy? What defines a recession? And are we in a recession at the moment?
It's an interesting set of questions there, Paul. The honest answer is that opinion is mixed about whether we are, strictly speaking, in a recession, because a recession has quite a technical definition. And November's GDP figures, which showed a 0.1 increase in GDP during that month, kind of threw out some of the more technical definitions of recession. However, to all intents and purposes, we are basically in recessionary times. And so, you know, economists might shout at you if you say we're in a recession right now, but I think in terms of the way that is normally experienced by those of us working in business, we may as well acknowledge that we're in one now. And if we're not in one now, we're almost certainly going to be in one very shortly.
So putting that in a bit of context, how is that affecting the early talent space?
Now that's the nub of this question, and it's a very, very interesting, it's a very interesting answer to me as a labour market specialist. The audience might differ in their opinions on this. Ordinarily, what you'd see at this point in the economic cycle, so if we compare the last real recession or last major recession we had, we're gonna leave COVID out of this because that was weird and hopefully it won't happen again. But let's go back to 2007, 2008. In 2007, Northern Rock failed. You saw people queuing outside the bank, and it was very clear that bad economic times were on the way, and so employers reacted by cutting in our space by cutting back. Not suspending, but cutting back graduate training schemes and training and so forth in early 2008. Now, in fact, technically speaking, the recession didn't actually begin in technical terms till the end of 2008. But as we are it's probably a similar situation to the one we're in now. Everybody could see that things were not right economically, and that we were in for tough times and reacted accordingly. However, that hasn't happened this time. It's not because people can't see difficult times coming down the horizon, coming across the horizon. They're clearly coming. Cost of living, inflation, very, very serious. Although the causes of the recession are different to the ones from in the previous recession, and so the economy is behaving differently. It's more like the early 90s recession for those of us who are old enough to remember that. But we have a labour shortage. We have a skills and talent shortage. We don't have enough graduates in a lot of key areas. And so the labour market is behaving differently. And as yet, most of the indicators are still flashing at worst amber rather than red. The data sources we're looking at, organisations like the Recruitment and Employment Confederation, who look after recruitment agencies, who are always a very important canary in the coal mine for this kind of events, are still reporting reasonably robust placement and temp billings. They're slightly down, but they're still ahead of where they would normally be. And candidate shortage is still very significant. And so we've got these kind of two warring these two warring effects of candidate shortage and a downturn. And at the moment, we don't see substantial, widespread cuts in graduate recruitment. Now, there is a third narrative, which is to do with tech layoffs, which I'm getting quite a bit. You're hearing quite a bit about, and I'm getting a lot of discussion within my networks. But do bear in mind that when Microsoft lay off 12,000 people in the US, here in the UK tech sector added over 100,000 new jobs last year. So Microsoft laying off quite a lot of people in America is a blow, particularly for the American tech labour market to an extent, but it doesn't touch the sides of expansion demand of the tech market just at the moment. So we're going to keep an eye on that, because if the UK tech sector follows suit, then we are starting to get into those kind of normal recessionary situations. But I think the Microsofts and the Googles and the Salesforces, who are all laying off at the moment, are also saying they over recruited during the pandemic. And most of our businesses in the UK didn't have the luxury of doing that, because Microsoft, Google and Salesforce were hoovering up all the available talent. So I wouldn't put too much emphasis on the fact that that's going on right now. We're monitoring it and seeing if it's going to become a trend, but at the moment that seems to have slightly underlying slightly different causes than the recession.
Are you seeing, Charlie, is there still in the early talent space, is there certain areas where there is severe skill shortages, or are they the common things?
Yeah, I mean, there's the obvious ones. Let's box the obvious ones off. We haven't got enough healthcare staff of any kind. We haven't got enough nurses. We haven't got enough doctors. And people may have seen that the government has told universities to stop training so many doctors, which is an interesting decision this morning. And we haven't got enough of any kind of healthcare or social care people. But they don't really touch the kind of early talent space that we're looking at, because those roles are obviously centrally planned. But we don't have enough engineers of any kind. We don't have enough techies. We don't have enough people in wide ranges of business services now, and a lot of these shortages are actually manifesting further up the talent, further up the experience chain. So it's very, very hard for businesses to hire experienced project managers or coders right now. But ultimately, that has a knock-on effect all the way down to supply at the bottom. So mainly, for our purposes, the shortages are mainly in business services and IT, which is where much of the expansion has taken place in the UK labour market over the last 24 months. It's those businesses that have transitioned successfully to hybrid working and found it's not really affected their productivity or their clients' productivity. And although it sounds, only two sectors, it does make up a substantial proportion of all graduate recruitment. Of course, they're two of the areas that we are strongest and employ the most people in the UK.
Perfect. So, Charlie, just are we in a severe downturn, or are we technically in a recession as we sit here today?
I defer to the Bank of England because they're the ones who decide. But I would say at the moment, technically, so I think it depends. It's a it's a difference between, it's splitting hairs to an extent. It's a severe downturn at the very best that will probably become a recession. But I think it's more likely we're in one. I think it's more likely we're in a recession. In as far as it affects all of us, there's no real difference. The only difference will come if the Bank of England, if it means the Bank of England feel compelled to do more tinkering with interest rates, at which point costs will go up again. And that will have an effect on things like site rental. It'll have an effect on business overheads of various kinds. It will increase cost of living, and staff will become more restive. So it has an effect in that sense. But in terms of the day-to-day operation of a business, there is little practical effect of the Bank of England declaring that we're formally in a recession or not.
Okay. You talked about the 2008 recession. You referred to that. What lessons have recruiters learned from the last recession?
I think
the
key one, Paul, is actually quite important from our point of view, which businesses were reluctant to cut their graduate training schemes entirely in the last recession, which was a set of lessons they'd learned the hard way in the 90s. It turned out that there was little risk in that. It might cost a touch more, but talent pipelines, it was important the long-term talent pipelines were preserved. And if anything, those businesses that were a bit more enthusiastic still suffered because signals were sent. So, for example, at the start of the last recession, the engineering sector dipped sharply, as is often the case because it relies on infrastructure spend and public spending. So businesses cut engineering recruitment, which means that a lot of engineering outcomes in 2009, 2010 were quite poor. Unfortunately, the recession lasted longer than 3 years. So students making their A-level decisions on the basis of a downturn were choosing their university degrees in the knowledge that the engineering market had fallen and that businesses were cutting staff. So what happened was they stopped taking engineering degrees, and we're still feeling the legacy of that. So I think the businesses learned the lesson that fundamentally you do not cut your graduate talents pool schemes lightly. It is not a snap decision. It is a decision that will have long-term impacts on your business. And it will affect you and your sector if you're a large player very profoundly, and it's a big risk. It's genuinely a big risk, and most people think this recession is likely to be relatively short. It's going to be pretty unpleasant while we're in it, but it's likely to be relatively short. And if it's a relatively short recession, you don't want to be cutting your graduate training schemes, because by the time your graduates come out of them, we'll be in recovery, and that's when you need them.
Perfect. Just define short for me, Charlie. Short for me is a day or a week. We're talking about.
Oh yes, sorry. I'm talking in labour market economic terms.
Okay.
Most people think that we will be in a better position than we are now by 2025 at the latest, possibly even next year, which would be very short. I'm a little more cautious. I'd say we're going to be in this for this year and probably much of next year. But I do think so. So to put this in perspective, if you cut your graduate training scheme for 2023, most graduate training schemes are 2 years in length. So the graduates coming out of the graduate training schemes and ready to manage new projects will be ready just in time for the upturn, just in time for business to start coming back properly, which is actually perfect timing. Now, if we had indicators that it was going to last into 2026 or even longer, that will be a different set of calculations to make. But there's little indication that it's going to be a really long, drawn-out process. So at the moment, cutting your schemes, it will be a bold. There are two kinds of organisations who would do that right now. It'd be a bold organisation. In the yes minister sense of bold, and for those of us again with long memories, Sir Humphrey would always restrain Jim Hacker from making a decision by saying that's a very bold or a very brave decision, minister. All those who are like the Microsofts and Googles, incredibly confident that if they overcorrect for hiring mistakes they feel they made in 2020 and 2021, they can just rehire whoever they like. Now, those of us operating in the tech sphere knows we cannot just rehire whoever we like right now. The market simply doesn't work like that. So, there are some, and for smaller organizations, it's much harder calculation, of course, because your schemes are a big overhead and a big sunk cost. And there may be, and I'm not saying it would necessarily and obviously be a mistake to cut your scheme. It will be a mistake to cut your scheme entirely if you think you're going to need graduates in the future, or apprentices, or post-16 talent, because there's very little to suggest that we're going to find ourselves no longer in shortage of talent over the next couple of years. Nothing going on that suggests that's not going to happen. So I think the decisions are finely balanced. I do expect some organisations to cut back, but I don't expect very many people to cut out entirely.
Charlie, I just want to interject at this point before we move on. There's a question from Hader, and it relates to something you said very recently. So based on what Charlie said, is it STEM in general that is facing the most shortages? That's
a very interesting question. It's not just STEM. So lots of business services roles are facing shortages. So things like accountancy, for example, and audit, and other areas of the finance industry. Accountancy, audit have got shortages. Tax and insurance have got even worse shortages, for example. But a lot of it is in much of STEM. That doesn't mean that all of STEM is in shortage. So, for example, we have no real shortage of biological scientists right now. It's a popular degree. We have quite a lot of biological science graduates. And although the pharma industry, for which I used to work, so I do keep strong tabs on what's going on there, has had a much better couple of years than it has had in the UK for quite some time. The pure sciences, if you like, probably not quite as strong at first degree level. Postgraduate level is a different matter, but at first degree level than engineering and IT and tech in general. So it does depend on a strict definition of STEM. But if you wanted a very good rough guide, if it involves coding, maths, or engineering, we're probably in shortage of it.
Thanks, Charlie. I guess thinking back what you said about referring to the recession of the early 90s, and I think it's interesting because really all of in our industry generally, and for us as individual workers, etc., our collective understanding of the recession is rooted in the 2008 global financial crash and the long tail of that. But of course, all recessions are different in their own ways, aren't they? They have a sort of strand of commonality. And this idea that we might be in an economic downturn, but the labour market is challenging, but relatively stable, feels counterintuitive.
Absolutely.
But of course, as you said, they could align more closely if things really get really, really tough. But for the moment, it's an interesting, almost phony war type of feeling, isn't it?
For the moment, the labour, the graduate labour market. So I'm being very careful here.
Yes, correct.
If you're in hospitality or retail, that's a very different matter. It's a recession, and the jobs market is not looking at all promising. But if you're a graduate in many areas, and no, again, not all, but in many areas, we are currently defying gravity, basically, and we may continue to do so because it depends if those push-pull factors, whether the labour shortage continues, because fundamentally over the last couple of years, demand has strongly outweighed supply, which is why last year, for the first time, the UK had more unemployed people, more vacancies than unemployed people. At the moment, as of the end of November, it's probably about in balance, but even that is really, really historically unusual. So, and bear in mind that most unemployed people have quite low demonstrable levels of skill and education. So an awful lot of the unemployed have no formal qualifications. So if you're in the graduate talent space, very likely in many areas, candidate supply has been far lower than demand in many areas for quite some time, and it will take a bit more. It'll take more recession, if you like. It will take more economic downturn before those push-pull factors start to balance out.
So you think that shortage
We're not
of
there
supply?
yet.
No, that shortage of supply essentially will mitigate to some extent the
Yes.
effects of the recession.
Yes,
Which is interesting.
I mean, they won't
idea.
cancel them out at all. And
No.
of course, the other thing to bear in mind is that inflation is high. So whilst it's very likely, and it's also worth stressing for any, and particularly for people on the chat who might be concerned, by far the most common experience for a professional during a recession is to keep their job. Even in the 2008-9 recession, which was horrible. Well, 2008-9, just to give you an idea of how horrible it was, the labour market didn't bottom out until 2011, and it didn't start recovering until 2013. So, or didn't start getting back towards where it was pre-recession until 2013. So we're talking 5 years of really bad labour market, but still well over 90% of professionals kept their jobs, didn't lose it, jobs or hours. So the likelihood is the very large majority of people on this call and the large majority of graduates will be relatively untouched. However, one crucial difference is interest rates plummeted during the last recession for a variety of reasons. They're not going to do that. And so if you kept your job, actually, often you find yourself, even if pay rises were not tremendous or frozen, not particularly worse off. We will all feel substantially worse off during this recession, because we will be, because the cost of living and inflation is increasing, so has gone up so rapidly, and that might affect people's perceptions in labour market terms. In terms of the balance of employment and unemployment, it may not look so bad, but in terms of people's actual standards of living and their lived experience of it, it could well be the next couple of years could actually be more unpleasant for those who remain in work than the last recession was. Because I'm here to fill everybody with joy and cheer.
Charlie, from an employer's perspective, if you take the ISE survey that came out last month, they were looking about an increase of employers struggling to fill roles has increased. Number of applications per role had decreased. So from employers' perspective, trying to access that talent or that early talent, is there kind of a sort of disconnect in terms of between graduates applying for roles?
Well, and that's a really interesting question. There is significant body of evidence that candidate behaviour changed as a result of COVID, and may have changed, or may have been adjusted permanently. But we've also got to bear in mind that one thing that always happens in downturns is the individual's appetite for risk reduces, and one big risk is I'm going to quit my job and get a new one. And so one of the first things you see when individuals start to see a downturn, particularly those in secure employment, is they are much less likely to want to leave their jobs. So we are in that odd situation where there will be some people leaving their jobs that have had a lot of cash shuffled at them, or just had an offer they can't refuse because the jobs market is still chugging along for professionals. But those roles will be harder to fill if you lose your staff, because the pool of people willing to move right now has shrunk dramatically. And it also means that the early talent space, people are less likely to take what they might perceive as risks. They may be hunkering down for jobs that suit them ideally, or for ones that are in cheaper parts of the world to live, that don't require personal disruption, that just look more secure, usually public sector roles. Although, again, I'm not sure if that would actually be a rational thing to do right now. It will look rational to many job seekers to seek roles in the public sector rather than the private sector, because traditionally that's been more secure. So there are those, if you like, normal candidate behaviours as a consequence of the recession. And I realise I'm doing a lot of air quotes during this talk. I don't know if that's very good or bad. It's probably bad. But overlaid on top of that, if you like, is changing candidate behaviours as a consequence of COVID. Candidates appear to become choosier about what they were looking for and about the things that would prompt them to take up or move jobs. They got much more interested in organisations that aligned with their own personal values. There was an extent of risk aversion. There was some candidate behaviours, and particularly obviously in the professional services field, remote and hybrid working became extremely popular, and there is still a large number of candidates who are simply not willing to countenance roles that don't include those. So there have been some changes in candidate behaviour. There's less willingness to take a leap. There is less willingness to consider jobs slightly outside people's comfort zones. And just, I think, less willingness to push a little bit from many parts of the labour market. And I think that's allied with risk aversion as a consequence of the recession. That's mean effective candidate pools have shrunk, and employer numbers are coming down. But we must also bear in mind this values-based thing has become quite important. So candidates do want to see that a business shares their values when they apply and when they make decisions about whether they want to further their career somewhere else.
I think you're on mute, Chris.
That's a first for the webinar. Congratulations to me. I was on mute.
We did quite well though, only 28 minutes
28 minutes, yeah. And air quotes I'm agnostic about, Charlie. And
okay.
Yeah,
it's Max of Management Consultancy.
Very much so. Yes,
I think, no offence to any management consultants on the call.
This is it's a real big question, isn't it? Around engagement and the characteristics of what's happening on the supply side, etc. And I think there's also something about confidence, isn't there, amongst students? When we were talking about the 2008 recession, I think student confidence took a battering then, largely because there was a lot of really, really doom-laden and negative media coverage about a lost generation of graduates who would never go into employment, etc. And even whilst that was happening, some of our careers service partners were saying that they were really, really busy with SMEs in particular, actually wanting to get in front of their students. But the students, to some extent, were feeling that there was no hope. And I'm wondering how, on the back of the lockdown period and all the drama and trauma of the last couple of years, how that's feeding in to the engagement situation.
Again, one of the things that's been very reassuring is the data that we have is that the long-term careers of the lockdown generation, the lockdown graduates, appear to have been pretty much unaffected by COVID. That's probably, at least in the UK, that seems that I'll be partly allied to recruitment shortages. So when you look at the outcomes of the graduates who graduated during COVID, 15 months after graduating, they had pretty normal outcomes. So that was reassuring to see. But obviously, they are a group of students, graduates, and young workers who have been through a set of experiences that none of us experienced at the start of their careers. They are very aware of that, very, very aware, because it was hugely formative for them. And they're anxious about their work readiness. They're anxious about the fact that they haven't had a lot of work experience and they were, shut indoors for a large portion of that period, and whether that has affected their ability to interact in general. They're anxious about themselves and their friends and peers. And I think the attitudes that will instill are going to be in them for the long haul. And I think that might shape the perceptions of that generation for a very long time to come. I do expect them to be a little more risk averse. Do expect them to be a little more cautious. So we will have to see how that pans out over the next few years. But as I say, that kind of experience that generation had, that's going to stay with them, I think. I don't think they're going to forget about it in a hurry.
No, of course not.
Charlie, you kind of touched on that. On one key theme is that organizations or companies in terms of who have strong work experience have really got a stronger talent pipeline, and
Yes.
that the students and graduates who are feeling anxious because they haven't got that work experience, the companies that have successful and kind of even through the pandemic look at solutions and workarounds to still keep their work experience programs going and strong. It's a strong pipeline into the graduate space, isn't it?
That's right. And there remains no more effective method for recruitment and for retention than a good work experience program. Most people who take work experience will stay with the company that they're with, and they'll stay longer.
Perfect.
So, but it's, it is an investment. It is it's work experience programs were pretty much the first thing to be cut during COVID, which was a shame. But we can understand why that is, because businesses were struggling to work out how they could deliver work experience in a virtual or hybrid environment. And I think actually largely that is still an open question. How do you really deliver a good work experience and assess, particularly when it's an accredited work experience program, how do you assess them effectively in a hybrid working environment? And I think I think there's a general feeling we have a little way to go with that, but the prize of getting it right is substantial, very, very substantial, because the business with a good work experience or apprenticeship program which works in a similar way, and I know we've had a question about apprenticeships, they convert effectively and also they retain effectively, and that investment is likely to pay off in the long term. The problem is it may not necessarily be visible in the short term, and when you're looking at things to cut, things that have not yet shown their payoff are a little bit easier, unfortunately.
Yeah. We've talked, Charlie, a lot about the early talent pool. Let's really understand the early talent pool, because this is a question and when I talk to employers, first of all, the first start of their attraction piece is actually understand that talent pool. How big or how small is that talent pool? And I was hoping, Charlie, you can sort of crystallize our thoughts by giving some examples and going through the actual size of this talent pool.
Well, that's very fortunate, Paul, because it just so happens I've got some slides here.
Perfect.
Hey audience, we've rehearsed this. Well, I mean, Paul and Chris are slick. I'm obviously shambolic, but so I'm going to share my screen, and what we're going to do is we're going to walk you through some scenarios for what happens when you start to slice the talent pool up. So let's start by sharing this screen. Should come in that way. Right, so I'll talk you through this. So what we're going to do is I'm going to start with a base scenario. Now, don't get too fixated on the exact numbers here. This is using this happens to be using graduate numbers from 2019-20. By and large, the graduate talent pool itself changes by increment rather than by degree. So in other words, the numbers will be broadly the same this year, and the effects of doing the things that I'm about to show you will be broadly the same. They won't be exactly the same, but it'll be in the same ballpark. So every year we have somewhere around slightly north of 350,000 UK domicile graduates. That's how many there were in 2019-20. So that's our base number. That's our graduate talent pool overall, and that's pretty big. That's brilliant. Everybody can have some graduates, can't they? So that's fantastic. So let's imagine that you are recruiting and you are trying to recruit women because there aren't enough women in tech or in your business, and you're thinking particularly the long term. You see, so your senior management team is a bit male. You'd like to increase the balance of women. So you're looking at women graduates here. Now, of course, most graduates are women. About 60% of graduates are women. So we slice that up. As yet, we don't have very many people. We don't have none, but we don't have very many people answering. We let people answer as whether they're men, women, or other, and we don't have very many people answering as other, which means we can't do a lot of work with that data if anybody's interested. And that's the reason why we don't, not because we don't want to. we don't have enough people in that group to be able to examine if that group face any particular employment barriers. That's just an aside. So we want women graduates. Let's imagine we're a tech firm. So we want women graduates this year. We were looking to increase our female talent pool. But we'd also like another EDI target. We'd also like to increase the number of women in the organisation and graduates at the same time who are not white. About 80% of graduates are white. In fact, minority ethnic students are slightly overrepresented in the UK student and graduate population. Around 16 to 17% of the UK population is from a minority ethnic background when you take them all together, but about 20% of students. So the UK HE sector is slightly more diverse than the population as a whole. So if you're looking to increase your the diversity of your intake, the graduate talent pool is actually a very good place to fish. So let's imagine we would like to get some more minority ethnic women in our organisation. Most of us would. So immediately we've gone down to 51,000 from that 376,000. So around 50,000 minority ethnic women graduate from UK universities. But we're a tech company, so we'd like some STEM graduates. So this is the entire talent pool of STEM, about 14,000. Normally we'd get about 13 to 15,000 women from minority ethnic backgrounds with a STEM degree. These are all perfectly reasonable numbers. You know, it's a perfectly reasonable thing. We've talked to a lot of businesses who are trying to hire more diverse populations in STEM, but this is your talent. This is the talent pool in which everybody is now fishing for that group. Now, of course, you're an employer with standards. You want the best of the best. So you want a 2-1. Now you've got 10,000 people. And of course, you always recruit from the Russell Group. So now you've got 2,800 people. And what you'd really like is some coders. And in the end, we've just got 90 graduates left across the entire UK for computer science women who are not white, who've been to a Russell Group university and have a 2-1. They're probably the 90 most sought after graduates in the country because everybody is currently trying to recruit them all at once. And that's why you can't get them, because there are only 90 of them. And every time you put a stricture in, every time you say, oh yeah, we'll continue to ask for 2-1, you are cutting out a part of the talent pool. Oh yeah, we're going to recruit from the Russell Group. You're cutting out from the talent pool. So do be aware that although there are a lot of graduates, every time you slice a bit off by putting a criterion in, you're actually probably slicing off an awful lot more. And of course, of those 90, say you're in London, about 2/3 of those have got no connection with London and probably not going to look at your job. Or say you want or say even more excitingly, you want people with work experience. Around 20% of them will have work experience. So just by specifying that work experience characteristic, or by having your job in London, you may have reduced yourself to a single figure of potential applicants without even trying, from 370,000 to start with. So do be realistic, particularly in the current market, about exactly how many people are in your potential talent pool when you put an advert out. You might think that the strictures you're putting, oh yeah, we want the 2-1 from the Russell Group with work experience. Just by doing that, you're probably bringing the entire talent pool down to entire potential talent pool, assuming every single graduate saw your ad. Just by doing that, you're probably reducing your talent pool down to the thousands at best, possibly even the hundreds, depending on whether you want any subject strictures at all on there. You know,
it's very sobering, Charlie. So it
is, yeah.
Of that 90, would it be right to say that they won't all be people necessarily going on to work anyway?
Yeah, absolutely.
Some might go on to further study too, perhaps.
Yeah, so around because this is computing, around 15 to 20% will go into further studies, so they're completely inaccessible to you. So you're looking at around 75 people realistically who are available from that group. And bear in mind, as I say, every business that I talk to currently has an EDI initiative that wants more Black women working for them, and quite right too. But realistically, these are the talent pools in which you're fishing, because we simply don't have enough of those candidates to go around. So whenever you say, yeah, we want a 2-1, or yeah, we want a Russell Group institution, I don't want to deter people from putting these programs in place, because they are good and necessary. And the numbers that we've got at the end actually only illustrate that we need more women in tech. We need more women. We need more Black and minority ethnic women in professional work in general. We need more, and so all power to you, but do be realistic about the talent pools that you get. And the same will happen every time you put a spoken or unspoken group in. I'm going to go back up there. Every time you advertise your job and it looks very male, and your workplace looks very male, and your board is very male, congratulations, you've cut your potential talent pool down by around 60% straight away, because the boys will apply and the girls won't. And well done. There's only 157,000, but there's about 150 to 260,000 boys every year, and 220 to 230,000 women. So making your business look overly masculine in general is just a bad move from a talent perspective. It's just a bad move. Men are more likely to move. Men are harder to retain. They have higher salary expectations. I'm not saying everybody should recruit women by preference, because that will be wrong and also illegal. But if you're deterring women from your jobs on a very practical level, it is a very poor idea for your business.
But Charlie, the challenge that you've just outlined there, I mean, is compounded also by regional factors, isn't it? And propensities for graduates to migrate or not migrate. So could you say a little bit about how we understand that dimension?
Overlaid on top of all of that, and it's quite hard to do with the way that we approach these numbers, but overlaid on top of all of that is the fact that most graduates are not that mobile, and around 45% of graduates, in any given year, have gone to a local university and stayed locally to work. So as soon as you specify a location of work, the majority of people who apply for that location of work will have a connection to that location of work, either having lived there or studied there, or in some cases have a partner who'd lived there or studied there. That's a little harder to quantify. And those people without that connection to your place of work are very much less likely to look at it. Now, the place that the largest number of graduates have a connection to is London. And so London is the place that the largest number of graduates will consider working in. But it is also the place that the largest number of graduates will not consider working in under any circumstances. So, as soon as you have geographical location and hybrid work, one of the reasons why hybrid working is effective is because it doesn't completely take that out of the equation, but it has a significant dampening effect on that decision-making process, because it means that your average student from Leeds, who ordinarily wouldn't consider working in London, could at least countenance going there a couple of times a month, or once or twice a week. I mean, obviously this all depends on the trains, and the less said about those the better, but it does mean it's imperative for business that the trains get fixed. So it flattens that out, but it doesn't remove that part of the equation entirely.
Just talking about that, because these figures are really sobering, Charlie, and some of them even astound me looking at that. I think the key takeaway is that to really understand the early talent space before you set your KPIs and attraction strategies.
Yeah.
Is there hope in the horizon? There is talk about an increase of cohort to maybe 425,000, which is a significant increase from what you're saying now. Is that going to have a real knock-on effect through all sort of channels?
Yeah, one of the things that's poorly understood in the UK right now is that one of the largest birth cohorts in UK history is currently going through the secondary school system. It's in about year 8, 9. So come 2030, 2031, the 18-year-old cohort will be one of the largest, so easily the largest since the baby boomers of the 60s. And that will have profound economic and social effects. There'll be a lot more candidates on the market, but this group are already showing very strong signs of being very values oriented, and having a political and social outlook that is a good deal more liberal than the UK is used to. So once that group are in the workplace, they are very much more interested in green issues. They're much more interested in diversity than previous generations. So once that, there will be a lot more candidates, but there'll also be a lot more demanding, and they will have the weighted demographics that means that they can basically force social change to a level the baby boomers did, and probably have the same lasting impact on the country. Now, politically and socially, that's very interesting, but it will also have impact on employers. So brace yourselves for them. You've got about 4 or 5 more years before they start showing up in your talent pipelines, and you're going to have to bend to accommodate them. Now, I suspect many of us will not mind that at all, but there will be some businesses who find it difficult.
But it's already there, though, isn't it, Charlie? To some
Yeah,
extent,
yeah.
and that
Yeah.
Indeed in Glassdoor survey recently. I mean, that was extremely high levels of commitment by candidates to EDI, inclusivity, diversity, etc., and an expectation that employers would have strategies in place to implement that. That's
right. And Indeed and Glassdoor found, with a very large survey, because those two organisations are very wide reach indeed, multinationally, 72% of 18 to 34-year-olds would not join or consider leaving an organisation that they felt were not sufficiently committed to EDI. So it's not even enough to have policies in place. You've actually got to carry them out, or that generation, or younger workers. In fact, actually, to be honest, it was over 60% across the board. So most workers would consider leaving a company that didn't talk the talk as well as walk the walk on EDI. But that generation, especially, and of course, that group of young, the difference between that and the kind of breaking demographic wave is, at the moment, although younger workers do live those values very strongly, they don't yet have the sheer weight of demographics on their side yet, but they will.
Yeah, absolutely.
And when they're in their late 20s and starting to make hiring decisions themselves and starting to be management decisions, they will have a cohort of younger entrants to the labour market that will be so large that they will shape everything.
Yeah, and
so
there's no
things
sense.
Are going to change. Things are going to change.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no sense at all that this is a sort of an idealistic sort of strand that will bump up against the reality of, say, a downturn in the job market. This is here to stay, isn't it?
Because they will change. Because the point is that when they're they're the leading edge of a huge demographic wave, they will not bump up against reality and be changed. Reality will bump up against them.
And as Paul mentioned, I mean, I think was it a record number of students entered university this time around, more than 400 to 420,000.
Well,
so
actually, we've got to be quite careful. A record number applied to university.
Right, okay, but there's a large number.
But it's very large numbers.
It is, isn't it? Yeah.
Because university is a better bet than the alternative, despite pretty negative press. The simple fact of the matter is the only parts of the economy that have consistently grown has been the graduate labour market.
I want to use that to pivot to there's two questions about apprenticeships. You mentioned them earlier, Charlie, and Ariane and Ruth have asked one. Firstly, a similar one about what do we think about sort of ratio going forward between graduates and apprentices, and then a second related point is this idea that everything still seems pitched towards the university experience, but actually that is being challenged by the rise of apprenticeships and questions about value, etc. But from what you're saying just there, it's still clearly seen as the credible mass experience, isn't it?
That's right, because apprenticeship. So the apprenticeship question is a very, very interesting one. So let's focus on degree apprenticeships, because let's be candid, there are significant questions to ask about the quality of apprenticeships in the UK in general. And the House of Lords and the House of Commons are both very concerned about the quality of what is currently packaged as the average apprenticeship, which is often just a repackaged training scheme designed to get funding from the government, but without delivering the learning that the entrants expect from apprenticeship. But that's not the experience of most students and graduates who are going on to very good, very well tailored degree apprenticeship experiences, which are extremely effective. However, there is one massive fly in the ointment here for mass acceptance of apprenticeships on an official level, and that is that the whole system is being gamed massively by the wealthy, to be quite candid. The big selling point of apprenticeships and degree apprenticeships in particular is they're supposed to be a tool for social mobility, but in fact the problem is effectively the sharp elbow middle classes have twigged that these are really good experiences that allow their kids to get good quality degrees with work experience for nothing, and have elbowed the way to the front of the queue. And so in fact degree apprenticeships are currently less diverse than degrees in general. The intake of those degree apprenticeships are more affluent in general and from more selective social backgrounds. Degree apprentices are currently more likely to have parents that have gone to university than standard first degrees, and so they're really good, really effective for everybody who takes them, really effective for industry, really effective for university, and they are not achieving what the government wants from them. And I do not know how long that will be permitted to continue. So for those of us who are saying the degree apprentices are really good, they're really great, etc., etc., I am concerned that the way that they are as designed, they are not working as intended. They might be working as business and universities intended, and even the candidates, because they're all getting a great experience, but they're not working as the people who are funding these experiences intended. And I think at some point government is basically going to say, oi, we're not paying for this anymore. This is not doing what we're supposed to. And it wouldn't surprise me if that came quite soon.
Okay, Charlie, I'm conscious of time.
So do we have to be really careful with that?
I'm conscious of time, Charlie, and I want to sort of wrap it up with some key takeaways, because there's so many.
Yeah, now I've depressed. So who have I depressed so far? Everybody working, everybody involved in apprenticeship delivery. Is there anybody who's still happy? I can make you all sad as well.
No, I believe we're all sort of realists, but optimistic, because there is opportunities, as you've mentioned.
There is opportunity. So, for example, all it will take is for universities and businesses to be a little bit more diligent about their entry requirements for degree apprenticeships, and I think that will continue because the thing is they work and they're really good. We just have to make sure that those people with better resources are not gaming the system so that they get the most benefit from it, because that wasn't the intention. And I don't think it's anybody's intention, really. I don't think universities want that to be happening either. So yeah, sorry Paul, while I stop lecturing everybody, why don't you ask me something so I can wrap up properly?
Well, I just want to sort of, in terms of takeaways, let's first call very briefly on recession. You've talked that potentially we are in a recession.
Yeah.
But you've also, on an optimistic point of view, said that the recession could be a short recession and we could be out there by 2025.
Yes. So it won't feel short while we're in it, but hopefully, in terms of the effects on long-term long-term careers and long-term business plans, it may not be quite as, I don't think currently is likely to be quite as bad as the last one.
Perfect. And your key other takeaways is keep those talent pipelines going to maximize the benefit of coming out of the recession. And obviously with shortfalls in skills, we still need to keep recruiting. Yeah,
and I think a final clue, which is implied, but I'll state it bluntly. If you're a recruiter, don't expect a load of candidates to suddenly come onto the market that weren't there before. Don't hold off because you think, oh yeah, there'll be a lot of people unemployed in the autumn. It'll be easy to recruit them. Doesn't seem to be much indicate. You know, if you're struggling to recruit coders now, you're still going to struggle to recruit coders in the autumn. So don't hang on in the hope that it will get easier and cheaper to attract talent. It might do marginally, but the cost to your business of not recruiting now, if you could, are probably going to be greater than the savings you'll make by recruiting a little bit later when things might be marginally easier.
And moving on to the early talent pool is the key takeaway is actually understand the size of that talent pool when you're setting realistic KPIs on your traction strategies.
Yeah. Do we have time to address any of the questions in Q&A?
Yeah.
Good.
We do, Charlie, and
really smart ones in there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I should say that the ones that we won't be able to cover in the time remaining, we'll be very happy to follow up with afterwards if we can sort of make contact via the ISE and the registrations. But just referring back actually to when you did that model and that coming down the stairs of criteria to 90 people that you were left with. So I suppose
not putting too many strictures in at all as well.
No, exactly, and kicking out one of those
outlandish. That's the crucial thing.
Absolutely, and one of those sort of props to that is the 2-1. So the question here is, do you think there will be more of a shift by employers to scrap the 2-1 classification and focus on skill set in the future in line with ISE predictions? Do we have indications of why this is, i.e. a need to expand the talent pool or application numbers, or a better understanding of transferable skills? If you could deal with that, Charlie.
It's an excellent question, and I think yes. I think the fundamental question is yes to all of those. One of the issues, so I do get a lot of questions about skills-based hiring, which is becoming increasingly popular in the US. The US, it's a little easier in the US because of the way they've got their skills system, if you like, organized, and a little more difficult in here because we don't have a shared language on skills, although we're working towards it in the UK. But I do think the idea of a 2-1 as a marker of quality is starting to fade away. Most students get them, besides anything else. And also it's quite clear that graduates with 2-2s in particular are not, there's no step change in quality because somebody got 59% overall in their degree because instead of 60. So I do think that is fading out in terms of in terms of selectivity, because the number of good quality candidates you leave on the table by doing that is now unacceptable. And I think there's also a recognition that there are inequalities in who are more likely to get a 2-1 that mean that, particularly if you're interested in increasing the diversity of your talent pool, it's not the best marker. So I do see that diminishing. It won't go away entirely. It may be that in the future, if candidate supply is eased, it will come back. And but I don't see it having quite the same importance that it used to, because I think those businesses that have moved away from it have found no real impact on the quality of their applicants, and a pleasing impact on the diversity.
Okay, thanks, Charlie. I think maybe just one quick fire crystal ball gazing question, if you can answer this one, and it's potentially a biggie, but maybe you can do it succinctly. How do you think the availability of jobs will look across the UK? During the 2008 recession, the vast majority of jobs are located in the sort of London bubble. Will this be felt across all cities in the UK? That's from Nicola. If you can answer that.
No offense to the rest of you, but I was hoping we'd get this question because that's a really, really good question, Nicola. Excellent. So it's really interesting. So London's the most popular hiring location for graduates, and about a quarter of graduates ultimately end up working there at some point during their careers. But COVID counterintuitively affected the London and London labour market far more than anywhere else. I suspect this recession will follow the usual path, in that the large urban centres of strong graduate labour markets will be least affected. It's usually SMEs that bear the brunt of it, and they usually tend to be more important for the smaller, more dispersed labour markets. So London, Manchester, Birmingham, Glasgow, Edinburgh, Belfast, Cardiff, and Bristol are going to be the less affected areas, and smaller towns and cities will be more heavily affected. That said, obviously the rise of hybrid working does muddy the waters a little bit there, and may mitigate the impact, particularly for those areas outside the cities. I'm hopeful that we won't see the same impact, because in the last recession, and particularly public service cuts, meant that urban centres outside the kind of regional hotspots got hit very, very badly indeed, in a way that they still haven't recovered from. I'm hoping that that won't be quite as serious this time, but we will be keeping an eye on it. It's an area that we're particularly interested in. It's an area that we'll be particularly monitoring, Nicola. So we will be looking at that. But I think a hard and fast rule is, unless it's a pandemic, London isn't going to get the worst of it.
Thanks, Charlie. And just before we hand back to Stephen, everything that you've talked about and more than that even is available on our Luminate website, isn't it? So it's luminate.prospects.ac.uk. Some of you may be signed up to that already, but you can get a newsletter and it's got all the latest insights and data and research and intelligence. So thanks for covering that so comprehensively, Charlie. Thank you. Stephen, hello again.
Fantastic, thanks very much. So great insights as ever from you all, very much appreciated. I think it reinforces the point that we're quite keen to make, which is that we shouldn't just treat the UK graduate labour market as this one amorphous blob. Actually, it's not. There are a whole bunch of different pressures and forces on it, which you've very eloquently articulated as usual, Charlie. So thanks everybody else. Thanks very much. Thanks very much to yourself, guys at GIST Prospects for supporting us with this webinar. Pleasure as always.
Oh, pleasure.
Events on like this without you guys. And as I said, if you've got any questions, either get in touch with the team directly or come through us, and we'll be more than happy to connect you. Enjoy the rest of your day, everybody. See you all soon.
Take care. Bye.
Goodbye, everyone.